As I mentioned, World War One, well, when it started, was thought by all sides that it was going to be a short war. The slogan, "The war is over by Christmas." They thought this in Germany, in Britain, in France, and elsewhere. Turned out to be tragically not true. It was a horrifically bloody 4-year-long stalemate. Okay, there was the left wing of the SPD. As I said, the SPD, German SPD, voted for the war credits. There was a large left wing which was not too happy about this. I mentioned Rosa Luxemburg, but there was other groups as well. There was a guy named Karl Liebknecht, who was a leader of the left SPD faction in the German parliament. Liebknecht was a socialist lawyer. He was actually the son of Wilhelm Liebknecht, who was a drinking buddy of Karl Marx, also a socialist, an early socialist. He originally voted for the war credits. He was one of the people who voted for it. He thought he had to obey party discipline. He was torn up inside. Then he torn up outside. Okay. In 1916, there was evidence of growing war weariness. The war wasn't over as quickly as people thought it was going to be, and there's evidence Germany was going to lose the war. It was a stalemate. So in one instance, there was a bread riot in Berlin. Housewives, women whose husbands or men were off in the war, they were in a really tough situation. There was a riot. There was growing war weariness. And so the left-wing SDB parliamentarians saw an opening. They had originally voted for the war credits. They were not too happy about it. They voted against it. This was a bombshell. This began, so the leadership of the SPD, who had, by the way, during this time, they essentially had been controlling the German working class on behalf of the German ruling class. The SPD supported the war. They had pro-war editorials in their papers. Anyone who opposed it was censored or expelled from the party. And they cooperated with the government. In situations like that, it's very common. They got very little out of it. Throughout the war, there was increasing censorship against the SPD, increasing crackdowns. It's possible if Germany had won the war, the SPD itself would have probably been literally taken over by the government, made into some kind of state labor organization or something. I don't really know, but they got very little out of it. But they got caught in a bind. They were pro-war. War was turning into a disaster, and the pro-war leadership had nothing to offer. So the left wing, who had long been very unhappy about this, saw their support for the war, saw an opening. They voted for the war credits. They voted against the war credits, and the leadership warned them, like, if you basically keep doing this, you'll be expelled, and actually were expelled. In April 19, there was a split. And the once mighty SPD was split. There were two parties. It was a split from the top down, and the split people who left it were both what's called the centrists, Kautsky and Bernstein, and then the left wing, Rosa Luxemburg and her friend. There was a group called the Independent Socialists, or USPD in German, in April 1917. It was very confused. It was mostly a split from the top down. A lot of members didn't really know why they were leaving, but just the same. So oddly, very dramatic split. Oddly, the new party had some odd and unstable. It was an odd and unstable mixture of centrists and radicals. Karl Kautsky and Bernstein were in the new Independent Socialist Party, and so was Rosa Luxemburg. She was with her old nemesis, people she had debated against. She had an organization called the Spartacus League. It came out of her leftist network. For no connection with the group today, a Trotskyist group called the Spartacus League. They're not the same thing. The newer modern group took the name, but there's no direct historical connection. But Rosa Luxemburg's group was called the Spartacus League. They existed for a time as a faction in the USPD, in the same party with our old enemies. The rationale was that you have to go where the working class goes. The SPD was somewhat of a left split from the USPD was a left split from the SPD. You go where the workers were. There was a large movement which wanted Rosa Luxemburg to leave the Spartacus League, to leave the USPD. Rosa Luxemburg resisted that, so we have to appeal to the workers who were wavering. Okay, this was the situation in Germany. While this happened, Liebknecht himself, Karl Liebknecht, he was a member of parliament. He made an anti-war speech, and as a punishment, the army sends him to the army, basically a punishment battalion, a hard labor punishment battalion. He was a guy in his 40s, and he wasn't in great health. And because of this, he became a hero to the working class as the mood turned against the war. Okay, so Russian Revolution in 1917. There were two revolutions in 1917. There's a lot of history. I could make a whole video on parts of it. Huge amount of history. I'm just condensing, highly condensed nutshell. First, Russia was throughout well into the 20th century, the early 20th century, was a semi-feudal autocracy dominated by large landowners and the army, very repressive. It started industrializing by the late 19th century. Russia, though, was in a gridlock situation, and the essay, or the book really, 1905, it's on the Marxist Internet Archive, Trotsky gave a very good Marxist analysis of the situation Russia was in. Basically, they were in a gridlock. They were in profound gridlock. The state was controlled or dominated by large landowners. The peasants had been nominally freed, but they were very heavily in debt. They couldn't move. They couldn't relocate. Ultimately, a market couldn't develop, and there were some sharp barriers, very sharp barriers to industrialization. So Russia was industrializing, but there were some barriers to it, and since the large landowners couldn't budge, they were blocking industrialization development, they couldn't really budge. There were some huge contradictions. There was a gridlock situation. Liberal is in Russia, who had long originally opposed the Tsar and wanted to open up society. They kind of, by say 1905, sort of before the revolution broke out, kind of made their peace with the autocracy and more focused on making pro-imperialist. The Russian liberals, well, we can't really develop through development of Russia internally. Let's turn towards imperialism, towards plunder from other countries, towards foreign expansion. And Trotsky developed a lot of this theory. And so several generations throughout the 19th century, there are several generations of young revolutionaries influenced by utopian socialist ideas to different extents tried to overthrow the autocracy. It failed. History of this is really fascinating. Anyway, so liberals had split and became kind of pro-imperialist by this time. So the Russian Socialist Party developed by the late 1890s, very hard to organize in Russia, and developed in conjunction with the Union movement, very hard to organize, very repressive situation. And there were various local groups and movements. Lenin and others helped organize the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the first nationwide Marxist Socialist Party. In Russia, there were huge debates and struggles. Two famous factions were Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Originally, there was a difference of temperament among the leaders of this party, but rapidly evolved towards political and organizational differences. Marx famously wanted a somewhat tighter party structure, and the activists wanted activists to be full-time professional organizers responsible to the leadership. There's a theory that Lars Lee, who's a Norwegian scholar, has a theory that the idea of Leninism itself has been exaggerated. There's an argument that our modern interpretation of Leninism is kind of a little exaggerated. Lenin said party activists should be, quote, professional revolutionaries, basically meant very well organized. Lenin's ideas are often interpreted or maybe misinterpreted to mean an intellectual elite ruling over the workers, leading the workers. This may not have been quite what I don't think quite what Lenin meant. There was also the Bolshevik Party, or Lenin, is often stereotyped as highly authoritarian and basically cult-like. Actually, there was a huge, incredible amount of debate in the Bolshevik Party, and Lenin had to constantly argue for his viewpoints. He constantly, tirelessly argued for his position, what he felt needed to be done. And he had polemics against Kautsky when he turned out to be a reformist, a centrist, called The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky. Powerful arguments against the hypocrisy of centrist and social democrats and liberals, the inner contradictions. They're not really dealing with their own contradictions. Lenin also had polemics and debates with Rosa Luxemburg. He agreed in some areas. They were both revolutionaries. He differed sharply on the organizational question and how to organize a party, the organization and role of a revolutionary party. but they could understand and admire each other. The idea of a rupture between them has been exaggerated. So, okay, in the Russian party, there was huge sentiment in both the Bolsheviks and Menshevik factions for a reunion, and Lenin constantly argued against this. It would compromise our principles, and it turned out he was right. So, the final split happened in 1903. So, the difference is, what are the main theoretical differences? The Mensheviks were more conservative. They had a, might say opportunistic, they had a classic Marxist stagist interpretation of Marxism. Like Marx said somewhere that no social order disappears before all the productive forces for which there's room in it have been developed, and newer higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society itself. Famous Marx quote, like you can't go on to another level of society until all the productive forces of this current society have fully matured. Lenin and the opposition kind of disagreed. So the Mensheviks had this idea. They're politically, from that they derive the fact that Russia is a backward, semi-feudal country. So basically, we're not even have fully developed capitalism. Let's not speak of socialism. So the role of a socialist at this time is to tail the bourgeois, tail the liberals, and workers should support the liberals, should basically tail them, support them from behind, not take a lead, not lead the struggle, and then eventually, when we fully develop, then we can work for a socialist society. And as a kind of a one-dimensional view, very, very one-dimensional view. So the workers would basically play second fiddle to the liberals. Trotsky analyzed in his work 1905, he analyzed how the Russian and later work, how the Russian bourgeoisie was not able to fulfill its historic destiny. Like France, the French Revolution, 1789 to was 1795 or whenever it was, they had a historic role. The French Revolution went through many stages, but they cleared away some of the debris of feudalism. France was united as a country, had one currency. They got rid of internal customs unions and all these horrific survivals from the aristocratic society. They set the stage for the further development, internal development of France, and kind of modernized the country, as well as democratic reforms, kind of freedom of speech, etc., etc. As constrained as they've been. Well, Trotsky thought this couldn't happen in Russia. The Russian bourgeois, Russia was late to unify, late to industrializing. The bourgeois class in Russia was very late. And at this stage, they could not fulfill their historic task because they were tied into the landowners, they were tied into the capital. Russia was getting a lot of foreign investment before the First World War, especially from France. But ultimately, it was a parasitic development. The Russian ruling classes would not be able to develop their society. So there was a synergy between Lenin's thought and Trotsky's thought, later developed into the theory of permanent revolution. That is, the working class, and Trotsky developed the theory of permanent revolution from experiences in 1805, from things Marx said about the revolution of 1848, that basically the best defense is a good offense. Ultimately, it's up to the working class. The working class must take the lead. Liberals, representing the bourgeois class, would not be able to move society forward. And we can see this today. The bourgeois of developing countries would become a comprador class dependent on foreign capital. They would not be able to develop any national independence and internal development of the country. We've seen this today in modern times. So there were, as I said, the Russian Revolution itself, in a nutshell, World War I went very badly for Russia. There was horrific slaughter. It was a meat grinder. There was massive incompetence and corruption on behalf of the Tsarist autocracy. Russia lost something like 2 million people in World War I out of a population of 91 million. There were two revolutions. In February of 1917, protests started on International Women's Day in Petrograd, which used to be St. Petersburg, but because that is a German name, it was named Petrograd. This escalated into mass protests in Petrograd, And at one point, the Cossack security, who maintained security, kind of let it be known they weren't going to suppress the protesters. And there were mutinies, and basically the government lost control of the capital city. There were mutinies, and effectively a strike. The army was rapidly falling apart. Tsar Nicholas, massive, he was almost his historic destiny to make one bad move after another, time after time after time, one horrific blunder after another. He left Petrograd to investigate the troops, which had no purpose whatsoever, just made the situation worse. At one point, then at home in Petrograd, famous story of Tsarina and Alexandra and Rasputin, the government, the royal court turned into a circus. The regime pretty much lost control of the capital city. And when Tsar Nicholas's generals, when he was riding around his trains, trying to investigate, trying to inspect his troops, the generals told him, game's over, like, you're going to have to abdicate. And he did. And at that time, a group, this February 1917, a group in the Duma assumed power as the provisional government. Finally, after many generations, about 100 years, generations of activists who tried to overthrow the brutal, corrupt autocracy, finally Russia was finally a republic. Same time, workers' councils formed in the cities. This was a tradition from 1905. They took over industry. They formed a separate government, essentially. And for 9 months, there was a dual power, kind of a standoff, which was a very unstable situation. The provisional government came to be led by Alexander Kerensky, who was in this party called the Socialist Revolutionary Party. He was in a right-wing faction of it. He was supposed to be close to the Soviets, and he was very nominally supposed to be under the authority of the Soviets, but he quickly disregarded Soviet instructions. And he made a blunder. First, there was a powerful move to both end the war and to peasants wanted to confiscate the estates. There was mass armies made of peasant conscripts. They wanted to go back home, take over, get rid of these horrible landlords, and go back to farming, go back to their villages and towns. And Kerensky, continued the war. He was tied in the European capital, French, British capital. He did not want to do this. He banned the seizure of landowners, of landed estates. Well, we're going to deal with this later. We can't deal with this, and he cracked down on that. He began cracking down on the Soviets, and it was an unstable situation. Kerensky's government became intensely unpopular. There was a situation in July of 1917, is what they call the July Days. Really very complicated. They're basically huge protests. There was originally the government began cracking down on an anarchist group, and workers were in Petrograd and elsewhere were enraged by this. There were mass protests. Lenin and the Bolsheviks felt it's not time. We can't overthrow the government right now. We can't overthrow Kerensky. We're going to have to, they put themselves at the head of this to tone it down, to let it down. There was also a powerful mood of the Soviets, who were workers' councils, to take power, and they could have. But the conservative elements dominated them. Mensheviks and other more conservative socialist elements dominated. There was one incident where a crowd of people said to a Menshevik leader, "Take power, you son of a bitch." And another incident where Trotsky actually saved a Menshevik leader who was about to probably be lynched by radical workers, really pissed off at his inaction. Trotsky saved his life, let him out of the car, even though they were political enemies. So as I mentioned, there was what's called the July Days. There was an attack on an armed anarchist camp. There were mass protests against this, and it was a revolutionary situation. Lenin knew it was premature, and he let it down softly. The Bolsheviks put themselves at the head of this and let it down softly. So after the July Days, there was a period of repression, and the Bolshevik leaders had to go underground. They were jailed, and things changed, though. The war continued. It continued to be a meat grinder. At one point, Kerensky attempted a horrible military offensive, and estimated that 100,000 were killed. This made him intensely unpopular and eroded his position. His base of support was Kerensky's base of support was rapidly dwindling, and became obviously a growth of a right wing, wanted to end the revolution, go back to normalcy. In one incident, Kerensky actually ordered the provisional government ordered troops who were supposedly protecting Petrograd from the Germans. He ordered them on an offensive, which had no military purpose, and it was a thinly disguised attempt to get the Germans to occupy the city. presumably they would crush the Soviets. A replay of what happened in the Paris Commune, where the French and the Prussians were kind of cooperating and crushing the workers' government. And okay, this attempt flopped. Kerensky was conveniently out of the city at the time. It flopped, and radical workers at this time were radicalizing, were in a very militant mood. Then there was the Kornilov affair, basically a right-wing general attempted a coup, and it failed, tried to overthrow the Kerensky government. It failed. The Bolsheviks and radical workers fraternized with the soldiers and convinced them to refuse to obey Kornilov's orders to fire on workers, and his army literally melted away. This was a case where the Bolsheviks did not support Kerensky, but worked with his government, or not worked with his government, but allied from below to oppose the coup. They were in effect opposing some support from below to fight the right, but without joining Kerensky's government. So that's an example of what I talked about, the Mitterrand affair in France, and this perennial issue. So Lenin opposed the right without joining the bourgeois government. So, okay, his right-wing general attempted a coup. It failed. Kornilov's army melted away. He died shortly thereafter. There was evidence that Kerensky had been conniving with Kornilov. Kornilov, I believe, was originally his Minister of Defense. They were Kerensky himself maybe wanted to institute a dictatorship with himself in charge. After that incident, so the Bolsheviks came out on top. They got a lot of prestige. They were organizing the workers' defense. And Kerensky's position became weaker. He continued to look more and more pathetic, and he made several desperate attempts to form a coalition government with any workers who helped him prop up his regime. And you're just apparently waiting for the right time to crush the Soviets. So it's a dangerous situation. October, in the Russian calendar of 1917, the Russians had a military defense committee, which they got control over it away from the provisional government. And there's a cruise ship, Aurora, naval ship. They took the Winter Palaces peacefully. There was a painting, really fascinating painting of the officials of the provisional government there drinking at a bar inside this Winter Palace. I mean, they know the ends up. It's really grim. These czarist generals or officials, they're all drinking, getting drunk. They know that. They know they're doomed. So finally, they peacefully surrendered, and Soviet Union, Soviet power was established. The workers' councils took power without firing a shot, really. There was street fighting in Moscow and other cities, but in the immediate period after this, very early Soviet period could be, I think, considered the most democratic society in the world. Workers ran society. You see the movie Reds with Warren Beatty and Diane Keaton, kind of based on the life of the journalist John Reed, who was one of the early founders of the U.S. Communist Party. He wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, which is an amazing first-hand account by an American of the Russian Revolution, and very few Americans were there at the time. Amazing, it's a classic literature. So the movie 10 Days That Reds shows a lot of the excitement that was going on in the Russian Revolution. It's hard to imagine today, decades of Cold War propaganda, but the Russian Revolution took power, sent shockwaves around the world. And after the Cold War, decades of propaganda, hard to imagine, but at the time there was a mass strike in Seattle. Seriously, Rosa Luxemburg talked about a mass strike. There was one of these in Seattle in 1819 where workers took over the city. They were inspired by this. There were a wave of revolutions around the world inspired by it. There was a Hungarian revolution of communist government. Radical socialist government briefly took power in Hungary. There was revolution in Germany. There was a Finnish civil war. There were radical workers' movements in Italy and elsewhere. Okay, so the German Revolution, I'm going to talk about it very briefly, and very important history, not as well known. Pierre Bruy, a historian, I think he died about 10 years ago, he wrote the classic history of the German Revolution. Okay, so Germany was losing the war. And as they lost the war, the Woodrow Wilson or the Allies said, supposedly an armistice, but said, the Tsar, the Kaiser has to abdicate. And the generals, German general, military who were kind of running things behind the scenes, said, yeah, okay, Kaiser has to abdicate. And so they actually put the SDP in charge. The Workers' Party, after all these years, finally actually was in power. Not as good as it sounds. The army was really running things behind the scenes. This is the right wing of the party. There were a couple of people who were basically bureaucratic hacks. They were clearly on the revisionist side of the SPD in these debates. They didn't really take any part. They were bureaucrats. A guy named Franz Ebert, Philip Scheidemann, and a few other people. Gustav Nosk was famous. In one incident, really interesting, Philip Scheidemann declared, "We're a republic." And there were Scheidemann and Ebert were running. They were there, I think, the chancellor and the president of Germany or something like that. I forget exactly, but Ebert was the chancellor. He's a saddle maker, our former saddle maker who worked his way up the bureaucracy of the SPD. And Philip Scheidemann was like number 2 guy. He was eating soup, and some journalist at a restaurant. Some journalist asked him what type of government Germany's going to have. Oh yeah, we're going to have a republic. Franz Ebert heard that, and he was pissed. But the purpose of Scheidemann saying this was to declare a republic. Okay, we have a republic. Was that Liebknecht, or they talk about Karl Liebknecht, made a speech that this is the beginning of this. I now declare the Socialist Republic. It was a slogan. Didn't mean anything, but I now declare the Socialist Republic. So Scheidemann said this to forestall this. Anyway, Ebert was pissed. Their story. Franz Ebert was really pissed at that. So that was one thing that happened. The SPD was nominally in charge. There was the Kiel Mutiny in November of 1918. That was the center of the German Navy. Germany had lost the war by this time, and the naval leadership had planned to. There are different stories about this, but had planned to sail the German ships out in the English Channel, have one more battle for no reason at all with the British, or scuttle their ships, basically. And it was guaranteed to be doomed. Just wanted to preserve the honor of the German Navy. Well, the sailors had other ideas. They said, nope, sorry, we're not going to do this. And I thought there was a mutiny. There had been an earlier mutiny, I believe in 1917, in the German Navy. A group of sailors took over a ship. They tried to contact the Independent Socialist Organization in Kiel, and it took them a long time to get, like, what should we do? We took over a ship. What do we do now? And it took the Independent Socialist Organization a long time to get back to them. When they finally did, they gave them horrible advice, like, oh, try to negotiate with your officers or something. And so the mutiny failed, and the leaders were hung. This was the second mutiny, Kiel Mutiny, November 1918. And of course, this succeeded. Of course, this was in the shadow of the Russian Revolution. Workers had taken over Russia for a time and sent shockwaves around the world. So after the Kiel Mutiny, the sailors took over the ships, and then they took over the town. Throughout this triggered workers' uprisings all throughout Germany. Workers' councils began taking over governments literally everywhere. Local monarchies, which had run the silly system of duchies, who has still run things, were collapsed. Like, Germany was unified in 1871 by Prussia. It was still a system as part bourgeois democracy, part feudal. They still had these local kings. Bavaria had a king. These local principalities were part of the German state. A really weird system. And the whole thing finally collapsed in 1918. In the wake of the Kiel Mutiny, their workers' councils began taking over governments everywhere. The local monarchies fled. Now, this is not as great as it sounds from a socialist perspective. Workers took over governments, but there was no organization or leadership to coordinate, and it was chaos. And in a period of time, months, the SPD, who was in power, they attempted a coalition government with the USPD, and SDP. First of all, the leader, Franz Ebert, at the time said, famous quote, "I hate revolution like the slick sin." I mean, the SPD leadership wanted to forestall revolution. They did not want a revolution at all, and they cooperated closely with the army, the German army. The German army actually used them to co-opt and marginalize and crush the revolution. Pierre Bruey's book is a masterpiece, describes how this happened. It's kind of painful reading. But so what happened? So it was a chaos. So SPD was in power. First, they offered a partnership in the coalition government, the USPD. They wanted to use the USPD. Initially accepted, then realized USPD itself was chaotic. They resigned. Then they realized they were being used. They resigned. So it left the SPD in collaboration with the German government. They began destroying the workers' councils. So they were co-opting them, saying stuff like, well, we have to do this legally. We're gonna socialize production. We're gonna take over factories and workers run them. But we have to do this legally. Just wait. Let us take care of everything. And the workers said, okay, well, we'll go along with it. Okay. And they appealed to more conservative workers. But when this didn't work, often it didn't work. They used force. There's right-wing private army developed called the Freikorps. They emerged from shock troops of the old imperial army of the Kaiser. And they were essentially right-wing private armies. They recruited like right-wing German students from upper wealthy backgrounds, sons of landowners, etc. And they weren't Nazis. They were the predecessors of the Nazis. Came out of that. So they were essentially right-wing private armies. Nazis came out of that milieu in Munich a few years later, sometime later. So, in effect, the SPD was working for the German army to demobilize the workers' movement and preserve capitalism. This split, which I talked about between like Rosa Luxemburg and the left wing in the SPD, and then the revisionists, became deadly. Okay, so the culmination of this period was called Spartacus Week in Germany, or Spartacus Uprising in Berlin, January Uprising, January of 1919. Basically, Berlin was the capital, a very important place. It was kind of chaotic. It was one of the last places run by German workers. It was packed by demobilized sailors, who were demobilized soldiers and workers who were really angry, very militant, pissed off. It was a very chaotic situation, though. So, oddly, it revolved around the firing. The SPD finally tried to crack down, destroy these workers' councils, and oddly, the movement to preserve the workers' council revolved around the chief of police, a guy named Emil Eichhorn, basically the Berlin chief of police. He was an independent socialist, a left independent. For the left, later on, he joined the KPD, the German Communist Party. But so Berlin, the left wing in Berlin had an uneasy coalition of leftist groups centered around Rosa Luxemburg's group, the Spartacus League. There was also a group called the Independent Shop Stewards, and the USPD, Independent Socialists in Berlin, was much more radical than elsewhere. So had somewhat uneasy coalition. Okay, so it was kind of more or less led by Rosa Luxemburg and her former life partner. They split up, a guy named Leo Jokydžis, who was a Lithuanian socialist, and he was an organizer, not great in theory, but a good organizer. So Berlin, when the SPD, the government, tried to crack down, there was a strike. Hundreds of thousands of protesters came out, and 500,000 strikers surged into the streets. There was a real power contest in Berlin, which could really decide the future of Germany, literally. And the SPD then sent in thousands of these Freikorps that came in by railroad track to ship them in. And there's a week of street fighting. And its revolutionary movement was crushed by the, quote, socialists, by the SPD. And the Spartacus League and these groups had some really bad tactics. They failed to take the telegraph communication networks. They waited too long before tearing up the railroad tracks. They finally realized they had to, but they waited too long. Interesting story. This would be contrasted with the July days in 1917 in Russia, where Lenin knew this uprising would not succeed. He let it down, saw when he knew when to wind it down. Okay, so a story a bit complicated. After the Russian Revolution, the SPD, at least nominally, kind of supported it. They kind of had to. They were privately horrified by it, but they had a Soviet ambassador. Later on, they broke relations with the Soviet Union. And so the Soviets sent this guy, Karl Radek, as the unofficial Soviet ambassador. He was in Berlin. He was, like Rosa Luxemburg, came out of the Polish socialist movement originally. He had worked with the SPD. He was an SPD journalist also. He was in the left wing. Like allied Rosa Luxemburg's faction. They didn't like each other. There was an incident where years earlier in Poland, Radek had been accused of stealing someone's coat and some books at a socialist meeting. And no one knows to this day exactly what happened. There was a huge a huge amount of bickering over this and factional fights being different branches of the socialist movement. Anyway, this was embarrassing to Rosa Luxemburg, and privately she probably seemed to hate Karl Radek. Anyway, Karl Radek went to Russia. He was active in the Russian Revolution, became one of the Bolsheviks, and since he spoke a lot of different languages and had a lot of experience in Russia, during the German Revolution, the Bolsheviks sent him back to Germany as kind of the unofficial ambassador, as a liaison between the Bolsheviks and the German revolutionaries. Okay, so he Rosa Luxemburg didn't like him, but they finally met, and Radek had talks with Rosa Luxemburg, and according to one thing I read, kind of convinced her that the Spartacus uprising was not going to succeed. You have to let it down. It's not going to go anywhere. Try to get out with as much. And okay, fine, convinced her that she needed to wind it down. She kind of started to, but it didn't work. There was a layer of hotheads, younger members of her group, the Spartacus League, who were super militant. They hated the betrayals, the earlier Social Democrats, and they said, no, we can't give up. And it was very hard for her to wind it down. Finally, it was crushed. Didn't really matter. The movement was finally crushed. And Karl Liebknecht himself, by the way, he was part of the Spartacus League. He was part of this. He had a lot of courage himself, but he was a loose cannon. He refused to listen to instructions from his party to try to wind this thing down. Rosa Luxemburg at one point said, I'm ending my political relationship with you. He was just out of control. And he meant, well, a lot of courage. But so anyway, at heart, and people can debate the problem of party organization. Luxemburg felt the Revolutionary Party should follow the working class, even into disasters, to help clarify the situation. While Lenin's model was a little different, the party would provide leadership for the working class, although there was always a back and forth. So the Freikorps, during this workers' uprising in Berlin, the Freikorps flooded into the city. There was a week of street fighting. The movement was crushed, and Luxemburg and Liebknecht were captured by the Freikorps. And we've seen this many times before. It reflects what's happening in Bolivia right now. So Liebknecht was, quote, shot while trying to escape. Euphemism. Rosa Luxemburg was. They had her at a hotel, the Adlon Hotel in Berlin. She was clubbed in the head. When she regained consciousness, she was shot. And SPD had an issue of their paper. Vorwärts had a sarcastic poem about them, mocking Luxemburg and Liebknecht, and it's got a huge amount of criticism. They were socialist workers, leaders. And then the SPD had to back down, apologize for the poem, but they didn't ever apologize for the murders or the crushing of the German Revolution. So this incident, the crushing of the German Revolution by the Social Democratic Party, which is what it was a division blood between Social Democrats and Socialists. The original division, or between Social Democrats and Revolutionary Socialists or Communists. There was a speech that Lenin made around that time. He first used Social Democrat in this sense. So earlier, the term Social Democrat simply meant socialist. Rosa Luxemburg used in that sense, Lenin used in that sense, people talk about the social democracy and so on. But the Russian Revolution, first World War I, when these Social Democratic parties voted for war credits, World War I, the Russian Revolution, and then the German Revolution, the role the SPD played in crushing this, that set a division in blood between Social Democrats and Socialists, and further one. They took different trajectories. So the revolutionary situation in Germany continued for a few more years after that, really from 1919 to 1923. Out of the Spartacus League, Rosa Luxemburg's Spartacus League, the KPD was formed, which was the nucleus of the German Communist Party, became a mass party, and so it attracted younger, more radical workers. The Independent Socialist was unstable. I think 1.2/3 of their membership joined the KPD, and the SPD played a really bad role in co-opting and marginalizing the movement. Shortly after this, there was what's known as the Kapp Putsch, an attempt at the right-wing coup, very similar to the Kornilov coup in Russia. And a right-wing general named General Kapp tried to pull a coup. It failed. Hitler, actually, young Adolf Hitler, played a minor role in this. He was a communications officer or something. Anyway, this coup failed, due to workers' action. This was a victory for the working class after they lost some big things. This was a victory. The coup failed. The cap which collapsed, striking workers blocked the railroads, and a victory of sorts for the working class after a huge defeat. After on next near future after that, a few years after that, the KPD made some really bad moves. They veered from, as Germany was in a chaotic situation in the immediate post-war period for a few years. The KPD was a mass party, but they made bad moves. They veered from extreme left to opportunism. There's the March action, where they basically forced workers to strike. There was an uprising in Hungary, in Hamburg, which was botched, utterly flopped. And they had a weird passivity. There was in 1923, there was the Ruhr crisis, where Germany, famous Treaty of Versailles, had to pay these really humongous indemnities, war indemnity to France and other countries. They fell behind. The French were really obnoxious about it. They sent their troops to occupy the Ruhr Valley, this coal mining area, to enforce payment. This created like an economic collapse in Germany, this massive, famous hyperinflation, and there was really a revolutionary situation. The KPD, the Communist Party, it was their perfect moment. After a series of defeats, there was potential of leading a revolutionary situation, and they were weirdly passive. And after that, the moment passed. Germany, shortly after this, was able to reach Weimar Germany, some stability. The revolutionary period had passed, and everyone knew it. Everyone definitively, Bolsheviks knew it, German leftists knew it, everyone knew that. And this had the final ending of the German Revolution, had a big effect on developments in the early Soviet Union. Soviet Union had a worker state. It was economically very backward. They'd gone through World War I and a devastating civil war, which had set the economy way back. They were hoping for a socialist revolution, especially in Germany, to bail them out, to help them out. Germany was a developed country and could have made a huge difference for Russia. Now, like, the wave of pessimism and feeling in Russia like we're totally on our own. No one's going to help us now. And anyway, this was the dividing line, division blood between social democracy and socialism. And okay, in the next video, last video of this series, I'll talk about the role of social democracy, how it props up capitalism to this day, and everything these videos should be seen as introductory. It's not a deep scholarly analysis of it, but kind of an introduction to this topic. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you.